This is House Planning Help, episode 193. Hello, I'm Ben Adam-Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Simon Corbey from the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, the ASBP for short, and we're going to be looking at whether it's a good idea to specify uPVC windows. First, a project update, which I do from time to time, particularly when we hit landmarks. For example, we are now ready for the tender process, and this is really the last step before we start building. So very, very exciting, slightly surreal. And I think I need to high-five my wife, Kay, who you've heard on the podcast a few times, and also point out something, because if you're working in a couple, which I imagine a lot of you will be doing, then it's quite good when you have different skill sets. And certainly one of hers, she's worked for some big companies like Mars and Serial Partners as a project manager. And so that has definitely been useful. I'd say at those points, I get all my energy in the morning. And by the time it gets to the afternoon or evening, I tend to be thinking, wow, should we just leave it till tomorrow morning when I can focus on it a little bit? And that is definitely not what my wife likes doing. She likes saying, no, this has to be done. We'll do it now. Another example, we went to the home building and renovating show at Excel at the weekend. And then it was about the middle of the day. Oh my goodness, those things are tiring, aren't they, when you wander around? And I was ready to say, well, we've had a good morning, haven't we? It's time to go home now. And we didn't quite do that. We kept on just going to all the list of people that we'd put down, and eventually we were the last ones to leave at 5:30 or whenever it closed. So yes, exciting times, ready for tender. I'm sure we'll have more on that tender process. Hopefully we're not going to get any big shocks over the price. If we do, it's just going to be another challenge to overcome, isn't it? Let's get to our featured interview with Simon Corbey. We had a chat with him in episode 167. What is a healthy building product? We discussed that. Today, is this one a healthy building product? uPVC windows? Question mark. We're going to dig in. I started by asking Simon, though, about the name. Is it uPVC or PVCU?
Yeah, really good question. And I have to say, I'm not sure. I see it displayed both ways. So that I prefer uPVC, but you do see it as PVCU a lot. So the U is the unplasticized, and the P is poly, which of course was a girlfriend of a friend of mine. I prefer to write uPVC, but it's equally common to write it the other way around. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it.
Well, what about PVC just on its own? Is that connected, or is this something different? I know we're talking about a mix of chemicals that can be used in various ways.
So plastic is either rigid or flexible. PVC is, if it's flexible, it'll have plasticizers in it. Okay. But unplasticized PVC clearly doesn't. So it removes the issues around plasticizers. So what you do have in it is something called stabilizers, and there are a range of metals, so lead and cadmium. I think the best thing to do is to call them plastic windows.
Plastic windows, I can deal with that. And really, are we talking about chemicals and that we're concerned about these chemicals?
I have to think that the consumer perhaps doesn't really think about plastic and where it's come from and all the issues around it. So when it comes to indoor air quality, plastic windows have never been indicted in any way in a negative indoor air quality. So the window itself is quite benign. So there may be a range of chemicals within it. But as a user, you know, your most pressing issue generally is around cost. And plastic windows are generally cheaper. At the moment, of course, they're refining their designs and their styles, and they're making windows that look exactly the same as timber windows, and heritage windows and conservation windows, and so there's quite an aggressive marketing campaign by the industry. It's well funded, of course. It's the petrochemical industry. That's a long answer to a short question.
You mentioned cost in there, and I can totally understand that. Is that really one of the key issues of why it's taken off? Are there other benefits?
I think there are others, Ben. I do think it's a sort of a lexicon thing. I mean, plastic windows, yes, they're cheap, so that's a good thing. That's a tick in the box. But plastic is seen as being man-made, I think, and there's a sort of assumption that that's somehow tougher and sort of more robust. So timber will somehow rot, and you've got to keep getting up a ladder and to maintain it. And somehow plastic is man-made, and that's an interesting concept that we think that somehow that's more robust, because I'm not sure it is. Again, I mean, I have been doing some work for ASBP trying to understand a bit more about how you draw a comparison between plastic windows and timber windows, and the life cycle and the manufacture is clearly a big impact. Polyvinyl chloride, so it's chlorine is a large part of that. Chlorine, of course, is used in swimming pools, and so in our water as well. So it's a common thing and doesn't strike any concern into everybody's hearts, I don't think. And to make chlorine, they make it mainly from seawater. It's hugely energy intensive, but these impacts are not really considered.
Well, maybe then we could look at the life cycle, because you would assume that if you have these plastic windows, they're going to last longer. You've already alluded to the fact that people think wood will rot. So can you do a side-by-side comparison as you see it?
I mean, that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to do a balanced comparison between timber and between wood. And of course, there's and plastic. I'm sorry. So there's a huge, you could do a podcast just on quality alone, I think. So much of the window science really has come in from Europe. So I used to work at BedZ, and the windows came from Denmark. The quality of timber windows in the UK, I think, is increasing. But there have been issues around windows from housing associations just informally. So quality is an issue.
So what makes a good window?
I would say functionality, really. So the window is your first port of call when it comes to ventilation. And all good homes and good indoor air quality is based around good ventilation. Because there's a lot of moisture that we generate in our homes, and we've got to let that moisture go into the environment. So opening a window, of course, is the best way to do that, keeping the house ventilated. And how you can open that window easily. Does it slide open? Can you clean it easily? And maintenance, people have a concept that plastic windows last a long time. You know, the formation of plastic has changed through the ages. So we've been familiar with it since the 60s, but the formulation has changed quite a lot over that time. And the industry has made great attempts to clean itself up. There's no doubt about that. But they're also known as an industry to be quite litigious. And so, so I have checked my PI, and that's fine. But I can tell you a little story about that.
Go on.
So I used to work at a place called Construction Resources in Southwark in London. So back in the late 90s, it was a place a bit like the Design Museum. We had solar PV roofs, and it was over 3 floors. Fantastic place. We did seminars on things like windows and life cycle analysis, and persuaded this company, Scottish Housing Association, to cancel an order for some plastic windows that they'd put in. And this got back to powers that be. We then started getting legal letters to Construction Resources, and there was a threat of court action and being sued. So it's quite an aggressive process. And my colleague who delivered the lecture was having letters sent to her at home. So I have checked my insurance, and we're fine. But yeah, so we know that plastic is made from petrochemicals. I think we know that. We don't really understand this thing about chlorine quite so much. And so we get through a lot of plastic products. PVC is 5 million tons every year. 8.6 million tons of chlorine was used to manufacture PVC in Europe in 2015. So it's hugely energy intensive. So from a life cycle analysis, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing.
Well, let's talk about that at far end of the life cycle then. What do you do with them when you finish with them?
Well, it's very hard to find reliable data for the UK to understand what the recycling rate for windows is just now. So, of course, there are quite a lot of issues about recycling old plastic windows into new product. Because old plastic windows, then some of the products, the stabilizers that were used at that time, lead and cadmium, have been phased out. So these are substances of very high concern, as concluded by REACH, which looks after the chemical registration process through Europe. So there are major issues about recycling old product into new product. But if you do an EPD of a new product, you'll see that there is an allowance for lead and cadmium within that product, 0.1 milligrams, admittedly, tiny quantities, but it is there on its environmental product declaration. So the Scottish Civic Trust suggests that 3% of windows are recycled into other products. We understand that it's somewhere between. The BRE suggests, according to the Green Guide, that the UK average is about 15%. I suggest that's high because if there's just too many issues around it, it's more expensive and there are more chemicals required and there are bigger risks. So it's a difficult one.
What about fire situations? Is this going to be any worse than wooden windows?
It is going to be so much worse, yeah. So I didn't really realise, but so the inhalation of toxic smoke is the biggest killer and the largest cause of injury for fires. And I think it's fair to say that it's a neglected area of fire science and fire safety engineering. There was a suggestion that this information toxicity data needed to go into construction products regulations and so should be available for everybody and for energy and calculations and so on. So we hope to do some tests, some fairly simple tests, comparing one against the other. But just at this moment in time, all the testing institutes are particularly busy as a result of Grenfell. What I felt was really interesting was that in the USA, there's been this interesting tie-up. So the Healthy Building Network is a network a bit like the Alliance of Sustainable Building Products, but in the USA. And they've got an interesting tie-up with the fire safety community. And they have made a very strong plea to stop using plastic products full stop. So I have started to make contacts with Kent Fire and Rescue and the London Fire Brigade. And there is some research underway. But it's early doors, I would suggest, this type of testing.
Is this because of the precautionary principle that you mentioned last time round?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to think that is definitely part of it. I think there's a growing interest in health and well-being generally. So, yeah, toxicity is a huge issue. If
you were about to replace your windows, then how would you go about that job?
That's a challenge. So, of course, it all depends what type of windows you want. I have timber windows, and these windows are 120 years old, and they're going strong, and they're a bit leaky. They're okay as far as I'm concerned.
And what about for a new build property?
Yeah, so of course we're trying to understand. I think, of course, windows contribute towards the fabric's performance, and they're an essential part of that. So triple glazed windows are appropriate, I'm sure, and double glazed windows. And so building science has come on a lot and new values have come down. Both plastic and timber windows can achieve Passive House Trust, certification. And actually from a performance angle, the top quality is there. So, you could make honest comparisons across both products. But certainly from a maintenance angle, I have a sense that timber windows do have a finite life cycle. And as I think you probably know, sometimes you'll see a sort of slight yellowing of plastic windows after a while. I'm sure you've noticed that.
Well, it's interesting. My history of housing, this one that we're renting at the moment, has uPVC windows. And I was looking around the estate. It's quite a maybe 80s estate, and virtually every house does. So there are downsides, as I see it. We talked about life cycle. We talked about the lifespan. One thing Lloyd Alter from Tree Hugger was always saying is that they're called replacement windows because you have to replace them every 10 or 15 years. There just seems so many downsides to it that it's surprising to me. This must be cost that's making it so widely used.
It is, and I suppose really that the price of oil and gas still remains stubbornly low. I mean, we somehow always assume that we're going to run out and prices will continue to rise, but that's probably not the case. So,
what is stopping timber windows from competing on price?
It's a good question. I mean, I suppose if you think about it, the sort of process of gathering timber and processing it and sawing it and milling it are actually quite energy intensive. There's quite a process. It involves there's a lot of effort, and actually making PVC is quite a cheap process. It's simple to do, if you like. Raw materials are cheap, and it's effective to transport them. It's quick and easy to do. So I do think that there's an opportunity for the UK to develop their sort of building physics and approaches to making windows. I think the average consumer is much more concerned about how the windows look and how long it's going to last. And these are the main things, and how they function, how they open, how they close.
That's a valid point. With our project, we've had to specify windows recently. And as a self-builder, I can't see why I would choose uPVC windows. It's very, very difficult. I think this is a mass market thing, isn't it?
It is a mass market, yeah. I mean, it's quite an aggressive, I suppose, proposal. I mean, I met the guy who was supposed to do the Everest advert with the helicopter outside and the feather inside. It's a slick marketing campaign. The timber industry in the UK, as I understand it, is quite fragmented. So it doesn't speak for one voice. I mean, there's so many different disparate interests but the plastics industry is a bit narrower.
We talked about timber. We talked about uPVC. What other materials are windows made from?
Well, there's aluminium, of course. Yeah, as a product, I suggest in some instances is a good specification, because aluminium is very durable, but it's, as we all know, it's highly energy intensive. So from a life cycle analysis, you tend to steer away from it. You can get composite timber and aluminium windows. Certainly that's the bed's edge window rationale there. So penetrating water is the enemy of timber. So aluminium sills, yeah, so that's appropriate. It does depend very much on the building, your location, which rain zone you're in. All of these things you need to try and think about, I would suggest.
Is there anything else that we should consider then about uPVC? You commented, I think, at this point when we were specifying our windows, and just said at least my wife didn't want some uPVC windows. So why are you so passionate about this?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I've been doing some deep research into this company, INEOS, and their plant in Cheshire. Something like 16 tons of mercury has been used. So back in 2014, they were caught dumping mercury into the Manchester Ship Canal. So this site has got a really interesting history, because it used to be owned by ICI. There was reports of ill health in a small village in the early 2000s. And so ICI had to compulsory purchase 26 homes because there was this toxic chemical leaching from this dump. And this dump has been used to make everything from nuclear weapons to World War II stuff. And actually, we don't really know what's in this dump. So ICI owned this site, bought up this village. They suddenly realised that there was a real long-term legacy issue here, and spent hundreds of thousands of pounds supporting INEOS to grow them. They government gave support. And then ICI realised that the best thing to do for them was to walk away. So they just cancelled all their debts and basically gave the site to INEOS. And today, if you look at the land registry, this dump has apparently no owner. So there is a completely toxic dump just there, which the council don't own. INEOS have somehow sort of redrawn the lines of their site, and conveniently they don't own it any longer. So it's a very murky world, I suppose, what I'm saying, Ben. And I feel motivated to try and bring this to people's wider attention. So, yeah.
It does seem in a lot of these situations when you're specifying materials that so much of it is closing the loop. Because if you're choosing these plastic windows, you just don't have a connection to that factory billowing out black smoke.
No, absolutely. That's another thing.
But how can we ever do it, or will it always be like that we're just never going to learn?
Look, I mean, I think just at the moment, I think there's a real massive sort of global campaign against plastics. Plastic, not fantastic, plastic in our oceans. I think we're starting to understand that we need to use less of plastic generally. So I think at ASBP, we're trying to suggest that as a society, we've just got to start using less plastic through and through. And all things that we do, and Windows being one of those things. Windows science, of course, has moved on tremendously. So there's a process where they're acetylizing. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. I think so. Wood. So it's basically in vinegar, and so they've got maintenance lives of over 60 years. Yeah. At the end of the day, I do think it's a price issue, but I think the timber industry is generally improving in the UK, and I'm sure there's lots of good possibilities.
Well, Simon, thank you very much for coming on today and enlightening us a little bit on plastics and uPVC and the origins. So thank you for your time.
Good stuff. Thank you, sir.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany today's session. You'll find them at houseplanninghelp.com/193, where you can review the main information. We've provided a summary for you. Perhaps you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. That's the place to leave them. And we'll link you across to the ASBP, that is the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. Also, Simon was telling me they just announced their keynote speaker for next year's Expo. It's going to be Professor Stephen Holgate from the Royal College of Physicians and the University of Southampton. He's done a lot of research into air quality, mainly external air quality, I think also internal too. So we'll call him the air quality expert. You can go and find out more information on their website, along with a link to Simon on Twitter. All of that at houseplanninghelp.com/193. Let's finish up on a hub update. And I wanted to answer this question. What stage are most of the hub members at with their projects? Well, lots of different stages, really. That's not very helpful, is it? I think the trend is that most people have their land and they're developing their plans, and we see them progress. Planning permission, sometimes they have random things that are going on. Every project is different. Some have just little issues that others don't seem to have. And it's nice to see that steady progress. We've got a number in the construction phase at the moment. Martin Smith in Ireland's just finished his build, so congratulations, Martin. Well done for getting through. What I wanted to emphasize here is that I think we'd be just as valuable if you're rolling up and you're thinking, well, do I want to build a house? We've got a lot of resources that you can chew your way through. And one big advantage you have in those early days is the time. So those resources will take time to work through. If you want more information about the hub, we're trying to make it easier to build a house, just providing support and also that community side. So people who've been there and done it, all at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Get the details. Thanks for listening today. Really appreciate your company. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.